Tonight on Nation to Nation, child welfare tragedy. 3 First Nation girls died in care over the last 6 months. We speak with Nishnawbe Aski Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler about what needs to change.
And I think that's the question that our communities are asking today, is when is it the right time? When is it the right time for this government to act?
Another UNDRIP declaration. The Liberal government makes another announcement about how it supports the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But what does it really mean? Our MP panel hashes this out.
House of Commons.
I'm Jorge Barrera. This is Nation to Nation. Kanina Sue Turtle, 15, and Amy Owen, 13, died by suicide while in care. Courtney Scott, 16, died in a house fire while in a group home. All 3 of these girls died in the last 6 months. All 3 girls came from communities represented by Nishnawbe Aski Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler. Fiddler is no stranger to these tragedies. Suicide and subpar mental health and health services plague his communities in Northern Ontario. Thanks for joining us, Grand Chief Fiddler.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, you've been in Ottawa a lot, especially this year, and usually it's because of a tragedy that's happened in your communities. I mean, I've interviewed lots, I've gone to your press conferences, and again, I mean, you're here because there's an Ontario Chiefs regional meeting, but at the same time, you know, news emerged that 3 girls, their ages 16, 15, and 13 from your communities, 1 from Fort Albany and 2 from Poplar First Nation, died while in care in the last 6 months. When you saw these, you know, this news emerge, I'm just wondering what you thought.
Obviously, we were very troubled by what we were hearing, and I think the other thing that really concerned us was the timing of these tragic deaths that have happened over the last few weeks or the last few months from Port Albany. Actually, there's 2 from Poplar Hill and 1 from Pekanchcum, that we were not made officially aware that this was happening involving our youth. And we just said that we have to look into this a bit further and find out what's going on, why it's happening, and what we need to do to prevent similar deaths in the future.
Now, do you know if the government has the Ontario government has a handle on exactly how many Indigenous children have died while in the care?
I don't have that information. What we've asked for from the province is some data in terms of how many of our children are in these types of homes, and they don't have those numbers, which is again very concerning. That even though they're funding the care for these kids, that the fact that they don't have a database to tell them how many of our children are in these types of homes right throughout the province is a concern. That's why we asked for that inquest to happen, because we need to look at the whole picture in order for us to begin to address the issues.
So you are calling for an inquest. What are the parameters that you're looking for this inquest to probe? What are you looking to see?
I think similar to the 7 Youth inquest that was held in Thunder Bay last year, which concluded in June of this year. I think through the terms of reference, we were able to broaden the scope of that inquest, and that's what we're hoping if and when this inquest is called into these deaths of these 4 young girls that the province, and we will be asking the federal government, similar to the role that they played with the 7 Youth inquest, that they should be part of their proceedings, since they're the ones that fund child welfare, and that we need to look at the broader issues that may be having an impact on these deaths.
So you're saying there's four young girls, 1 from Pekanchcum. What can you tell us about the Pekanchcum?
Well, I think that's the fact that we're just knowing about these deaths now, just like in the last few days, is as leaders of NAN, as the Grand Chief of NAN, I should be made aware of what is happening with our kids, especially those that are taken far away from home. And the fact that we're just learning about these tragic deaths this week is a concern, and that's something that we need to look into why that is happening.
Yeah, last time you were here was because of the suicide of 2 young girls. There's been 3 young girls, at least, who've died by suicide since the beginning of this year. There were issues in Attawapiskat. It's a constant drumbeat of tragedies like this. Has anything changed on the ground since you last came to Ottawa, pleading for some sort of intervention?
Very little, I would say, and I know that's a source of frustration for many of our families. The fact that these supports, the services that they need, are still not made readily available for them, and that's one of the reasons why we got involved with the Human Rights Tribunal case. Issues around Jordan's principle that whenever a child is in need and distress, that help should be made available to them when they need it, where they are, and to me that's what Jordan principle represents, and right now we're still far away from that.
Yeah, we're talking about Cindy Blackstock's human rights complaint over the underfunding that creates discrimination of First Nations child welfare services on reserves. And Ottawa, this Trudeau government, is fighting still Cindy Blackstock in this case, a year after she won. What do you make of that?
It's disappointing. We're a party to those proceedings now through our own intervention, which we were given status last year. And it's frustrating to hear the government's standard line about reconciliation, that there's nothing more important to them than the relationship with First Nations people or Indigenous peoples of this country. And yet they continue to fight advocates like Cindy Blackstock and others that are advocating for just improved, better health care, better mental health supports for our children, no matter where they reside.
One of the things that emerged during the Attawapiskat suicide crisis, or suicide ideation crisis, which was triggered by the death by suicide of Sheridan Hukama, was the connection between St. Anne's residential school, which was a notorious residential school where a lot of children suffered a lot of abuse. They had an electric chair inside that school. The connection between St. Anne's and the suicide crisis in these communities. And in terms of fighting, the feds, Ottawa, just won a court case against two separate court cases against St. Anne's survivors, who were seeking to find out why Justice Canada lawyers sat on thousands of pages of OPP police investigations that would have supported their claims under the residential school settlement agreement for their compensation. You sat in during one of those hearings, and you also seemed to find a common thread between what you were listening and what you were facing in the communities today. What is that common thread?
Well, I think it's just the despite Canada's assertion that that they want to create a better relationship with First Nations people, the fact that they're still oppressing the most vulnerable people in our community, our children, and now with St. Anne's, the Indian residential school survivors that are still living in our communities. Many of them are now elders, like Ed Mitat, Andrew Wesley, and others, and they're being subject to this very difficult, very painful process of going through the courts to try to access their records that will help them get a fair hearing, for them to get the compensation that they deserve.
All right, Grand Chief, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and talk about the myriad of issues that you and your communities are facing, and we won't be pulling the spotlight away anytime soon, so thank you so much for coming in.
Very much.
When we return, our MP panel weighs in on the Liberal government's latest announcement on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
My fundamental human rights are not up for debate. They exist. The UN Declaration confirms that the rights enshrined in the UN Declaration are inherent, so they exist because we exist as Indigenous peoples.
That we're serious on adopting and implementing the UN Declaration across all government departments and with the provinces and territories.
I'm Jorge Barrera. This is Nation to Nation. Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett was in New York City last week to announce the Liberal government was withdrawing another set of objections to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The government made a similar announcement last year, but what does it really mean? Our MP panel will hash this issue out now. Joining me now is Yvonne Jones, Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Affairs, Conservative MP Cathy McLeod, and Romeo Saganash, NDP MP. Thanks for joining us this week.
Thank you.
So let's talk UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Last week, the minister was in New York City at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to make an announcement that Canada was removing its objections to a document related to UNDRIP that has to do with free, prior, informed consent. This is a year after the Liberals announced that they were removing their qualifications to UNDRIP. You know, this seems to be really in the weeds, technical things. I'm just wondering, what actually does this mean?
Well, what it means is that Canada has now signed on to accept the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in its entirety, without the exemptions that had been imposed. And you have to remember that Canada as a country voted against this declaration on 2 occasions. Last year, Canada decided to accept it. This year, it was disqualified that it would be accepted without any exemptions. And I guess, you know, the commitment right now is to implementing the UN Declaration in Canada, and how we do that implementation with regard to our Charter of Rights, and how it will mesh with Section 35 of our Constitution. And we will be moving forward in doing this in consultation with Indigenous groups in Canada.
Now, Cathy, the Conservatives' concern about UNDRIP was that it went against or over the Charter and the Constitution, and that they gave it a qualified endorsement. Now, Liberals are still saying we're going to interpret it through Section 35 in our Charter. So what materially is the actual difference here?
You know what? I think I'm as confused as you might be on this. You know, a year ago they went and it was unqualified support. They were going to implement the UN Declaration. To me, that dealt with all the concerns or issues around you know, the free, prior, and informed consent. So, you know, if it gave additional reassurance this year to communities, it really, from my perspective, didn't change anything to say we're removing our, you know, qualifications. So, but we did have a chance to talk to the minister today, and I know we're going to have further discussion about this. Is what does this really mean? What are you doing? How are you going to go forward? So, you know, at the UN this year, I don't think it substantially changed the government's position. It was perhaps some extra reassurance, but really the hard work is not done and the confusion abounds.
Was this simply about extra reassurance? Now, you're intimately familiar with the development of UNDRIP, and you have a private member's bill calling on, you know, the government for all its laws to respect UNDRIP. What happened last week? What does it change? What does it mean?
Well, I've asked the minister to write this morning about what she meant, and it's still confusing. The answers are not very clear. Although I reiterated the fact that C-262, my private member's bill, just implements calls to action 43 and 44 of the TRC, and it also delivers on the Liberal promise. So, I still cannot get a straight answer with respect to whether or not they will support Bill C-262.
Do you have an answer for that one?
Well, No, you'll just have to wait and see. I mean, the bill is coming before the House of Commons.
Okay.
There will be a debate around the bill. I think what the qualifying factor here is that the government has accepted in its entirety the United Nations Declaration, of which Mr. Saganash has been a champion of and had a strong leadership role in implementing that on behalf of Canada. The reality is that our commitment cannot be fulfilled unilaterally. Mm-hmm. There is a process that will have to be gone through. That's where we're going right now. And we have to identify which laws, policies, practices that need to be changed to give full effect to the declaration itself. So there is a process, and it's not going to be just as cut and dried as yes and no. Okay. If we're serious about this, we have to do it right.
Okay. But last week was specifically about free, prior, informed consent, and I just want to jump to the definition, what that actually means and what the government believes it means. Now, Minister Bennett was quoted as saying this is the government's definition of free, prior, informed consent means, quote, "This is about making decisions together. It means not putting some fully baked project in front of people and getting them to vote yes or no." How did the government arrive to this definition of free, prior, informed consent?
Well, first of all, I think it's there's still some debate publicly and amongst Indigenous groups and individuals as to what that really means. From a government perspective, again, we don't necessarily see this as a complete veto over development or resource development of any kind. What we do see through UNDRIP is full participation, full engagement by Indigenous people in resource development projects. It's a process that will allow for us to work through where challenges and complications are. And I think at the end of the day, what we want to see in Canada, both Indigenous governments and the Canadian government, is progress.
Okay.
And hopefully this is a mechanism to get us there without railroading projects over Indigenous lands, that we do it with their participation.
So are you clear on what the government believes free, prior, informed consent is, Kathy?
I gave a very simple example this morning. It's a mining project. The First Nations communities have been involved since the start. It's the SSN, and they had a very unique environmental assessment process that they undertook, and they came out of that process and they said, we do not give free, prior, and informed consent to this project. So they have been part of the process. They've been part of the environmental assessment. They have said no. And I asked the minister directly today, you have a no on a mining project. Does that mean that the government will say no to that project in recognition of your commitments under the UN Declaration? And I did not get an answer. So I understand that there's projects that are very complex, pipelines, for example, but this was a very simple project where there was full engagement with First Nations. They came out with a very definitive statement. She was not definitive in her response, so I am not really sure, again, what it means.
Romeo, a group of Stolo bands just recently also rejected Kinder Morgan MOU on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Free, prior, informed consent, the definition that's been surfacing from the government, what do you make of it? What's your take?
Well, I look at it from a different perspective, from a legal standpoint. The way that our legal system works in this country, and it's true for the international law system, is the rights that are enshrined in declarations or other documents are never absolute. You have to find a balance between the rights of Indigenous peoples in these numerous cases and the rights of others in different projects. The problem in this country is that most projects, if not all, are unilaterally imposed on Indigenous peoples. So that's not even a process that's respected, in my view. And Site CDAM is a case in point.
So from my understanding is the committee, your committee, the Indigenous Affairs Committee, actually wanted to study the UNDRIP to get a clear idea of what's going on. What happened, Romeo?
There was a proposed motion by one of the Liberal members of our committee, and mysteriously that motion was withdrawn.
So the Liberal member withdrew the motion. Do you know anything about this? That a Liberal member put forward a motion to study UNDRIP at the Indigenous Affairs Committee, and then it was withdrawn?
Are you asking me if I know why they withdrew?
Yeah, do you know what happened?
I don't know why they withdrew.
Okay.
Feel free to ask them, though.
Okay, Kathy, did you get any explanation on why that?
You know, I can't obviously talk about committee business that's done in camera. What I can talk about is that decisions have been made over the next while in terms of where the focus of the committee is going to be.
Okay. Now, before we have about a minute and a half left, I want to talk about this tragedy that occurred in Nunavut last week. A man was shot by the RCMP. He appeared to be suicidal, and he live streamed it. This is the third instance in the last 6 months. You know, there's lots of talk about mental health issues. Yvonne, I'm just wondering, in terms of when you heard about this happening the third time, does need to be an intervention in Nunavut to deal with this?
Well, first of all, I want to offer my sympathies to the families and to the community. Anytime there is a death like this, or death of any kind, it does have tremendous impact in the community. And I know that the circumstances around these issues is having a tremendous impact there. So we certainly offer our sympathies to the families and to the community. As you know, it's currently under investigation. And by the Ottawa Police Force. And, you know, until that investigation is completed, it's really difficult to speculate or to pass comment as to what has occurred here. And personally, I do not know the circumstances around it other than what I've heard in the media, like others in Canada. So, you know, the investigation, I think, is going to be very key in terms of understanding what's happened in this region of the country in terms of the engagement between citizens and the police force.
Kathy, any thoughts on the situation?
You know, I certainly have to agree with my colleague on this one. It's tragic. It speaks to how far we have to go with mental health, and hopefully the investigation gives us a really good path forward.
Okay. Romeo, any last thoughts on this?
Well, I think that one of the options that the Nunavut government may consider is instigating an inquiry under the Public Inquiries Act of Nunavut. The minister has the possibility to do that, may do that. If it's a matter of public concern, I think it's becoming a matter of public concern that this is the third in 6 months. So this is serious and sad.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this week, and you know, we're going to keep on the issues, and I appreciate you guys willing to come in and debate the issues. So
thank you.
Well, I guess we'll reconvene next week.
Gotcha.
Thanks.
And we'll be right back after this break. I'm Jorge Barrera. That's all the time we have for Nation to Nation tonight. Todd Lamran will be in the host chair next week. But before we go, we're going to leave you with this video of Kanahus Manuel, a warrior, confronting Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett last week at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York City. Good night.
Yes, and Canada is still treating our people. I've served jail time for standing up for our rights as Indigenous people.
I think that is really that is
Canada lies.
A relationship.
Canada lies, and their norms are lying.
Tell me what the lie was. What lie have I done?
That you're trying to push forward this free empire for consent, which is lies. That's lies. You don't have the consent of Sabaton people.